The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the parking lot of Murphy's Diner into a maze of shallow puddles that caught the neon glow of the open sign. Inside booth 7, near the back where the vinyl was cracked and the heating rattled, sat a girl who hadn't stopped shaking for 3 days. Her name was Sophie, 17 years old. The long sleeves of her sweatshirt hid more than the October chill required. Her phone sat face down on the table, screen cracked from when he'd thrown it against the wall last week. She'd ordered coffee she couldn't afford and couldn't drink, her hands trembling too hard to lift the cup without spilling. Across from her sat the reason she was shaking. Marcus, 24, handsome in that dangerous way that had fooled her 6 months ago, the kind of smile that made promises before it made threats. He leaned forward now, his voice soft enough that the waitress couldn't hear, but hard enough that Sophie felt each word like a fist. "You think you can just leave?" His fingers drummed the table. Once, twice, the same rhythm he used before. "After everything I've done for you?" Sophie's eyes stayed fixed on the coffee, watching steam rise and disappear. She'd read somewhere that trapped heat always finds a way out. She wished she knew how. Outside, thunder rolled across the Montana sky, and beneath it, barely audible at first, came another sound. The deep, bone-rattling growl of motorcycles cutting through the rain. If you believe that no one should live in fear, that courage can arrive when hope runs out, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, where we prove that the strongest protection sometimes wears the most unexpected armor. Betty Murphy had owned the diner for 43 years. She'd seen everything: marriage proposals, breakups, late-night truckers crying into pie, and kids celebrating after prom. She knew the difference between a couple's quarrel and something darker. She'd been watching booth 7 for 20 minutes now. The girl hadn't touched her coffee, hadn't moved except to flinch, and the boy across from her had that look, the one Betty's own son used to get before the drinking turned him into someone else. Before she'd finally called her brother Jake and asked for help she'd been too proud to ask for. Betty's hand hovered over the phone behind the counter. Then she remembered the card Jake had given her last Christmas, worn leather, embossed with a phone number and 4 words, "When the law isn't enough." Her fingers shook as she dialed. 3 rings. Then a voice like gravel and salvation. "This is Reaper. Jake's sister. Murphy's Diner. There's a girl here who needs..." Betty's voice caught. "Who needs the kind of help police reports don't give fast enough?" Silence. Then, 10 minutes. The line went dead. Betty hung up and did something she hadn't done since her husband's funeral. She prayed. The Riverside chapter of the Iron Brotherhood wasn't what cable TV made bikers out to be. They weren't angels, but they'd all walked through their own hells and came out the other side knowing one truth: the world breaks people, and broken people either shatter others or become shields. They chose shields. Reaper, 48 years old, 6'4", with a scar running through his left eyebrow from a father who'd used beer bottles as punctuation, stood in the garage when Betty's call came. Around him, 5 others were mid-conversation about tomorrow's toy run for the children's hospital. Bull, the enforcer, was waxing his chrome. Mercy, the only woman in the chapter and a former Army medic, was checking her first aid kit. Ghost, who barely spoke since Afghanistan, was reading to his daughter over FaceTime. Wire, the electrical engineer by day, was fixing someone's radiator for free, and Preacher, who'd actually been ordained before the bottle took everything, was writing Sunday's sermon. Murphy's, Reaper said, and that one word silenced everything. They knew Murphy's, neutral ground, Betty's place. If she was calling them, someone was drowning, and the lifeguards hadn't noticed yet. Domestic? Mercy asked, already reaching for her med kit. Sounded like it. Bull set down his polish. The kind that waits for police to file paperwork? Or the kind that needs now? Reaper's jaw tightened. He could still smell his mother's perfume mixing with blood, could still hear his sister screaming while neighbors minded their business, could still feel how small he'd been, how helpless, how watching someone you love get hurt while the world turns its back carves something permanent into your soul, the kind that needs now. 6 engines roared to life. The rain didn't matter. The speed limit became a suggestion, and Murphy's Diner, tucked on the edge of town where Route 9 bent toward the mountains, became a destination. Sophie heard them before she saw them. Everyone did. The rumble started low, almost subsonic, vibrating through the diner floor, through the coffee cup, through her chest, where her heart was trying to remember how to beat without fear. Marcus heard it too. His fingers stopped drumming. "Don't," he said, his voice dropping to that register he used before things got bad. "Don't even think about making a scene." But Sophie wasn't thinking anymore. She was listening. 6 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. Through the diner window, she watched 6 figures dismount, leather vests dark with rain, boots hitting puddles with purpose. Betty moved fast for a woman in her 60s, meeting them at the door before they could fully enter. Reaper bent down so she could whisper, her weathered hand pointing toward booth 7. His eyes followed, and something ancient and protective clicked into place. He'd seen that look before, on his mother's face, on his sister's, on the faces of every person who'd learned that love can twist into chains. The girl was pale, shrinking into herself, while the boy across from her was all coiled threat and fake calm. Reaper knew that dance. He'd watched it his whole childhood. "Mercy wire, exits," he said quietly. "Bull, with me, Ghost, Preacher. Make sure Betty and the other customers feel safe." They moved like water, filling the space without crowding it. The other diners, an elderly couple, 2 truckers, a single mom with a sleeping toddler, watched with wide eyes as the bikers took positions, not threatening, protective. Marcus noticed. Of course he noticed. His kind always did, hyper-aware of their territory being challenged. "This is a private conversation," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, trying to claim the moral high ground before anyone could take it from him. Reaper walked slowly to booth 7, each step deliberate. He'd learned long ago that the presence of protection was often enough. Violence was the last resort, not the first. His shadow fell across their table, and he saw Sophie's eyes lift for the first time. In them, he recognized everything. The hope that died a little more each day. The calculation of whether running would make it worse. The exhaustion of pretending in public that everything was fine. The silent scream that no one seemed to hear. Until now. "You need to leave," Marcus said, his voice steady, but his hands betraying him, gripping the table edge. Reaper didn't respond immediately. He'd learned that silence was its own kind of power. Instead, he looked at Sophie. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man his size. "Do you want to be in this conversation?" It was the first time in 6 months anyone had asked Sophie what she wanted. The question hit her like a physical thing, and her breath caught. Marcus's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "She's fine. We're fine. I'm talking to her." Reaper's voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the diner dropped 10 degrees. Bull moved closer, not threatening, just present. 6'2" of solid muscle and scars, wearing a vest that read Iron Brotherhood across the back and a patch that said Toy Run Coordinator on the front. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone. Marcus's grip on Sophie's wrist tightened. She winced, and that tiny sound, that small, involuntary expression of pain, changed everything. Mercy was there in 2 strides, sliding into the booth beside Sophie, with a calmness that felt like armor. "Honey," she said quietly, looking at where Marcus's fingers were digging into Sophie's skin, "I'm a medic. Can I see your arm?" "She's fine," Marcus repeated, but his voice cracked now. The script he'd perfected, the gaslighting, the control, the isolation, didn't work when witnesses refused to look away. "Then you won't mind letting go," Reaper said. For a moment, the world held its breath. Rain hammered the windows. The neon open sign buzzed. A trucker's fork clinked against a plate. And in booth 7, a battle of wills played out in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Marcus let go. Not because he wanted to, but because for the first time in 6 months he was outnumbered, outmatched, and most importantly, seen for exactly what he was. Sophie pulled her arm back, cradling it against her chest. Mercy gently rolled up the sleeve, revealing fingerprint bruises in various stages of healing: yellow, purple, green, a timeline of terror written on skin. The diner went quiet. "Sophie, right?" Reaper crouched beside the table, bringing himself to her eye level. "That's what I heard Betty call you." She nodded, tears finally breaking free. "Sophie, I'm going to tell you something true, and I need you to hear it in your bones, okay? What's happening to you isn't love. It never was. And you deserve better than this." "You don't understand," Marcus started, but Bull's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Actually," Bull said quietly, his Louisiana drawl thick with old pain, "we understand perfect. Every man here has someone in his past he failed to protect. A mama, a sister, a daughter, and we swore we'd never let that happen again if we could help it." Reaper reached into his vest and pulled out a card. Not his, but one from the county's domestic violence shelter. "This place will keep you safe tonight. We'll make sure you get there. We'll make sure he doesn't follow. And then it's your choice, Sophie. Always your choice. But you don't have to go back to afraid." Marcus stood up, trying to reclaim some authority. "You can't just..." "Can't what?" Reaper stood too, and the height difference was substantial. "Can't offer a young woman resources? Can't make sure she knows she has options? Can't be witnesses to what we all just saw?" Ghost appeared beside Marcus, holding up a phone. "Already called the police. Told them we'd wait." Marcus's face went red, then white. "She'll come back," he said, turning to Sophie with desperate eyes. "You always do. You know you need me." And here's where Sophie surprised everyone, including herself. "No." Her voice was small, but it was hers. "No, I don't." It wasn't dramatic. Wasn't a movie moment with triumphant music. It was quiet and scared and trembling. But it was the first brick in a wall she'd been too exhausted to build alone. Mercy helped her stand, keeping herself between Sophie and Marcus. The other patrons watched as 6 bikers and one 70-year-old waitress formed a protective corridor to the door. As they passed, the elderly man in booth 3, a Korean War vet named Charlie, who'd eaten at Murphy's every Thursday for 30 years, stood up. "Young lady," he said, his voice shaking with age and conviction, "you got more courage than half the soldiers I served with." The single mom with the toddler smiled through her own tears. The truckers nodded. Betty squeezed Sophie's hand. An entire diner full of strangers became witnesses, and in doing so, made leaving possible. The police arrived 6 minutes later, 2 squad cars, lights cutting through the rain. Officer Martinez had worked domestic violence cases for 15 years and knew the statistics, knew that leaving was the most dangerous time, knew that most victims recanted under pressure, fear, or misguided hope. But she also knew the Iron Brotherhood, had grown up 3 houses down from Reaper's sister, knew these men weren't perfect, but they showed up when showing up mattered. Sophie? Officer Martinez approached gently. I'm here to help. Whatever you want to do, I'll support. But I need to know if you feel safe. Sophie looked at the bikers standing in the rain, at Betty holding an umbrella over her head, at Mercy, who'd stayed close without crowding. I want to go to the shelter, she whispered. I want to be safe. Martinez nodded. Then that's what we'll do. I'll escort you personally. These gentlemen can follow if you'd like. Make sure you get settled. Marcus was inside still, giving his statement to the other officer, his voice loud with indignation and excuses. But no one was listening to his version anymore. Too many witnesses, too much evidence, too many people who'd finally chosen to see. Before Sophie got in the police car, she turned to Reaper. Why? She asked. Why did you come? Reaper was quiet for a moment, rain running down his face, remembering another night 30 years ago when no one came. When neighbors closed their curtains and his mother's screams went unanswered. Because someone should have come for my mama, he said finally, and didn't. Sophie nodded, understanding in her eyes what words couldn't hold. Then Mercy stepped forward, pressing something into Sophie's hand. A phone number. That's mine, she said. Direct line. Day or night. Recovery isn't linear, honey. You'll have bad days. You'll doubt yourself. You'll think about going back. That's normal. But you call me when that happens, okay? Before you do anything else. The Iron Brotherhood followed the police car through the rain. 6 bikes in formation, all the way to the shelter on Grove Street. They didn't go in. Sophie needed space, needed to begin the hard work of healing without feeling watched. But they waited outside until the lights came on in her window, until they knew she was inside and safe. Then they rode to Murphy's, where Betty had coffee and pie waiting. On the house, she said, her voice thick, for Jake's sake and yours. They sat in a booth together, these 6 people society often feared, and were quiet with the weight of what almost happened and what actually did. She'll go back, Ghost said suddenly, his first words in hours. Statistics say she will. Maybe, Mercy agreed. 70% do first time they leave, but we gave her an option, showed her it's possible. That's more than she had this morning. Reaper stared into his coffee, seeing ripples from the rain still falling outside. My sister left 4 times before it stuck, he said quietly. 4th time she called me. I brought the Brotherhood. We moved her out while he was at work. Got her 3 states away. New name, new start. She's been free 8 years now. Teaches kindergarten. Calls me every Sunday. Bull nodded. My daughter's restraining order wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. But 6 bikers living in her driveway for 3 weeks? That made an impression. They shared their stories then, these broken people who'd become shields. Wire's mother, Preacher's ex-wife, Ghost's unit in Kandahar, how they'd found a girl in a compound who'd been sold at 12. Mercy's own past, the boyfriend who'd put her in the hospital before the army taught her she was stronger than she'd been allowed to believe. It's not saving them, Mercy said, voicing what they all knew. We can't save anybody. They have to save themselves. But we can be the thing that stands between them and the thing that hurts them, long enough for them to remember they deserve better. Betty brought more coffee, her hands steadier now. Jake would be proud, she said to Reaper. Your brother. He'd be proud of what you became. Reaper's jaw worked. Jake had died in a motorcycle accident 10 years ago, 2 months before getting out of prison for putting their stepfather in intensive care. The last thing he'd said to Reaper was, find the kids like we were, stand between them and the monsters, be what nobody was for us. And Reaper had. They all had. 3 weeks later, Sophie was still at the shelter, still scared, still healing, but no longer shaking. She'd started therapy, filed a restraining order, enrolled in online classes to finish her GED, small steps that felt like mountains, but she was climbing. And on Tuesday afternoons, Mercy stopped by. Not to check up. Sophie wasn't a project. But to sit with her. To be proof that survival was possible, that the other side of terror was real. Marcus had been arrested for violating the restraining order twice. The third time, the judge revoked his bail. Sophie's case had attracted attention, a local news story about the biker gang that protected a domestic violence victim. Donations poured into the shelter. 3 more women came forward with their own stories about Marcus. And in homes across the county, people who'd been minding their business started paying attention, started asking questions, started being willing to be uncomfortable if it meant someone might be safe. The single mom from Murphy's Diner called the shelter hotline 2 weeks later, for herself. Said if that brave girl could leave, maybe she could too. The elderly veteran, Charlie, started volunteering as a shelter escort, driving women to court dates, standing as a presence that said, "Someone sees you." Betty Murphy put up a poster behind her counter. "You are not alone. You have options." Underneath the shelter hotline number, and the Iron Brotherhood added a new patch to their vests, underneath the ones for toy. Runs and veteran support, Protector. Because sometimes the people society fears are the only ones brave enough to face what society ignores. 6 months later, Sophie stood outside Murphy's Diner. She'd been too afraid to come back, but Mercy had suggested it might be part of healing. Returning to the place where everything changed, but this time on her own terms. The bell chimed as she entered. Betty looked up from behind the counter and her face crumpled into joy. Sophie. They hugged for a long time, 2 women who'd survived different versions of the same story. Sophie slid into booth 7, same cracked vinyl, same rattling heat, but everything different because she was different. Stronger wasn't the right word. She still had nightmares, still flinched at sudden movements, still checked over her shoulder. But she was free. And freedom, even scared freedom, was better than captive safety ever was. The door chimed again. Reaper entered, shaking rain from his jacket. It was October again, the year turning full circle. He saw Sophie and nodded, a small acknowledgement between 2 people who understood that survival was its own kind of heroism. He sat at the counter, but before Betty could pour his coffee, Sophie stood up and walked over. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. Properly. Reaper looked at her, really looked, and saw what he'd hoped to see. Someone who was still fighting, still choosing, still here. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You did the hard part. You gave me the chance to do the hard part," Sophie corrected. "That matters." She pulled something from her pocket. A small patch hand-sewn, the kind you iron onto denim. It said simply, "Witness." "I'm making them," she explained, "for people who refuse to look away, who choose to see, who stand up when it's easier to sit down." She handed it to him. "You were the first. Thought you should have the first patch." Reaper took it, his scarred hands gentle with the small square of fabric. His throat was too tight for words, so he just nodded. Sophie smiled, tentative but real, and walked out into the rain where Mercy was waiting to drive her to her new apartment. Not the shelter anymore, her own place, small, but hers. Reaper watched her go, then looked at the patch in his hand. "Witness?" Betty poured his coffee. "She's going to be okay," she said softly. "Yeah," Reaper agreed. "She is." Outside, thunder rolled and engines rumbled. The Iron Brotherhood was gathering for another call, another person who needed shields between them and their monsters. And they would go. They would stand. They would witness. because broken people who choose to become shields don't get to rest, but they do get to matter. And in a world that often looks away, sometimes mattering is enough. If this story reminded you that courage wears many faces, that the strongest among us often bear the deepest scars, that one person's choice to act can change another person's life, then please, like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember they're not alone, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, where we believe that compassion is the most powerful force in the world. Before you go, leave a comment. Have you ever been a witness? Have you ever needed one? Because sometimes knowing we're not alone is the first step toward freedom. And if you or someone you love needs help, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. You deserve to be safe, you deserve to be free, and you are not alone. And